The following is a production of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, a program of the Washington State Library, a division of the Office of the Secretary of State.
Well, welcome to this episode of Literary News. I'm Flory Minot. I'm a volunteer book narrator at the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library in Seattle. And I'm delighted today to have author Kit Bakke with us. She wrote Protest on Trial, The Seattle 7 Conspiracy. I'm going to begin with a little bit of a biography of Kit from her website. Believing that the freedom to publicly dissent is the lifeblood of a functioning democracy, Kit Bakke was active in Students for a Democratic Society at Bryn Mawr College in the 1960s and later joined Weathermen's national anti-war, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist efforts. Born and raised in Seattle, she returned to work as a pediatric oncology nurse. She has bachelor's degrees in nursing from the University of Rochester and political science from Bryn Mawr College, as well as master's degrees in nursing and public health from the University of Washington. Now retired, she writes and volunteers in local philanthropic organizations. Kit has also authored two other books. In 2007, Miss Alcott's Email, which one reviewer described as a uniquely constructed bio-memoir. And in 2017, she published a young adult novel called Dancing on the Edge. But today we're going to talk about Protest on Trial, the Seattle 7 Conspiracy. So welcome, Kit.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I thought maybe before we get into the events of the book, you could tell us a little bit about what was going on in the United States in the late 1960s, early 1970s, just to sort of set the stage for those of us who either weren't alive or don't remember. What was the U.S. like back then? What issues were concerning the nation?
That is a good question, and you're right. There are a lot of people now who weren't alive then, or they were otherwise involved and weren't really paying attention to national politics. Basically, that was the era of the Vietnam War, and people who don't remember how America fought that war, it's worth noting how different it was from World War II, for instance, and also how different it is from what has been, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, our more current military efforts. The Vietnam War there was a draft, and the draft made a huge difference because almost everybody in the country knew somebody or knew of somebody who had gone to fight in Vietnam, either draft or volunteer. So it was a much more known about war, and it was clear to many people that it was a quagmire, kind of like maybe what's going on in the Middle East right now. It seemed unwinnable. Nobody could quite figure out why we were there. Vietnam is very far away from any border of the U.S. It had no air force, no real army to speak of. It was very much a sort of citizen-led battle against people the Vietnamese viewed as invaders from afar. Why did America think that it needed to change the government of Vietnam, which is basically what was going on? So there was a lot of protest against this war, led in many ways by college kids. College kids have energy and time on their hands, and they are starting to sort of pay attention to what's going on in the country in ways that maybe when they were in high school or elementary school, they weren't paying attention to. So that's what was going on in the U.S. It was primarily the Vietnam War. We were coming off of major civil rights issues, Freedom Summer. There were bombings and shootings in the South and repression of voting, a lot of stuff like that going on that was fairly public. And also, we have to remember John Kennedy was shot to death in '63. That was in everybody's memory at that time. And then the other thing is what was going on in the rest of the world. It seemed like in the late 1960s, there were massive protests and sort of semi-revolutions going on in countries all over the world. Most of the universities in Japan, for instance, were closed down at that time. The whole Paris movement of 68 was huge. Labor and students together basically shutting down the city, if not parts of the country. And then in Mexico, of course, the 68 Olympics in Mexico City was when, I feel terrible, I've forgotten the guy's name, the runners.
John Carlos.
Thank you.
And
yes, sorry.
Tommy.
Yes, good.
Davis?
Something like that. Right. The winners who...
Tommy Smith.
Yes, Tommy Smith. They placed first and third, I believe. And so they were in their event and they were standing on the Olympic podium with their Olympic medals, USA everywhere. And they gave the Black Power salute. A lot of things were going on in Black communities. Cities were on fire, Newark, Los Angeles, Chicago. So it was bottom line, it was a very tumultuous time.
Yes, indeed. I was a college student back in the late 60s as well, and you've described it very well. That's how I remember it as well. Just a time when that was uppermost on all of our minds was the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah.
So bringing that down to our city of Seattle, what was Seattle like at that time? Were they in step with the rest of the country?
Well, I have to say, I was not in Seattle at that time. I was born here, raised here, but I went away to college and was working on a sort of a national scale, spent time in Chicago and other places. So I was not here during the Seattle 7 conspiracy trial or that. So writing the book was it's a more objective look because it's not my story. This is the story of the people who were there. Mm-hmm. I did, however, know several of the defendants. When I was working in the national office of SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, several of the Seattle 7 defendants came through the national office from time to time. And so I did know them. So I was able to, I had friendly access, I guess, to the defendants and their supporters. And in fact, it was one of the defendants who suggested that I write their story because nobody had written it yet.
No one had written it. Wow.
And it was pretty unknown because Seattle was pretty much of a backwater in those days, which is hard to believe today, but it was quite true.
So what brought the people who came to be known as the Seattle 7, what brought them to Seattle? Why did they come to Seattle?
It was an interesting crowd, and a couple of them were actually local Seattle guys. There were actually 8 who were indicted on these federal conspiracy indictments. One, however, went underground and was not caught and did not appear for trial. So the trial itself, it became the Seattle 7, which is a funny coincidence with respect to the Chicago 7.
Yes.
I will answer your question, but
Go ahead.
It is an odd thing. The connection between the Seattle 7 and the Chicago 7, which more people have heard of the Chicago 7, because they were nationally known organizers. Tom Hayden, Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin. People knew their names, and it was a very high-profile trial in Chicago against them. And they were charged. The Chicago 7 was charged under the same federal conspiracy and riot laws as the Seattle 7. One of the disconnects is Chicago 7 guys were well-known nationally, easy to target. They got a lot of press. They, had top-notch attorneys, and it was covered well. The Seattle 7 were basically unknown. They were not national leaders in the anti-war movement at all. And so one of the threads in the book is trying to figure out why did the feds, the indictments came down and were announced by J. Edgar Hoover, who was head of the FBI at that time, and John Mitchell, who was the Attorney General of the United States. The president at that time was Nixon. So why did they reach across 3,000 miles to this town that really wasn't a big deal, Seattle? Why did they levy these charges against unknown leaders of a pretty quiet movement? Not totally quiet, obviously, but nowhere near the scope or the size of the protests or the level of violence that might occur or property damage. Nowhere near in Seattle what it was like in Boston or Chicago or New York or Los Angeles.
Is there an answer to that?
Yes, there is, but I don't want to give it away.
Okay, you'll have to read the book. So back to the Seattle 7, and maybe you could also comment on the SLF, the Seattle Liberation Front, and how that figured into their coming here.
So as I say, a couple of the guys, I'm going to call them guys, there was actually one woman and then these 7 men. One of the men left, and so it was 6 guys and one woman. There's actually a wonderful picture in the book of them gathered around with 2 of their attorneys. And it's from early 1970, before the trial. And it gives you a sense of what people looked like in those days.
Yes.
I mean, this was the day of afros. Everybody who had curly hair had long curly hair. And everybody else who had straight hair still had long hair. You really get a sense of them. It's important to remember that there were 2 of these folks were 19 years old. The oldest was 27. That's the generation that we're talking about. Michael Abels was one of the 19-year-olds. He was a freshman at Cornell University. He is one of 4 guys from Cornell who came out to Seattle at the same time. Then there was Roger Lippman, who was a Seattleite and, in fact, still lives in Seattle today. Susan Stern was the woman. Susan came to Seattle earlier in the mid-'60s. She and her husband came from Syracuse University, and he came to attend the University of Washington Law School, and she came to get a master's degree in social work at the University of Washington. So they had been in Seattle for several years. These Cornell guys turned up literally weeks before the demonstration that triggered their indictments. Next would be Michael Lerner. Michael Lerner was the 27-year-old. He was a PhD from Berkeley who had a 1-year assistant professorship job at the University of Washington in the Department of Philosophy. He was a Marxist philosopher. Then there's Chip Marshall. He was another one of the Cornell guys. He was a Cornell graduate. His best friend was Joe Kelly, who also had graduated from Cornell that year, and the 2 of them sort of hatched this plan to come out to Seattle. And as I say, Michael Abels, the high school kid, came along, or the freshman at Cornell. And then there was one kid who was not at Cornell but lived in Ithaca. His father taught at Ithaca, and that was Jeff Dowd. And he was also very young at that time. That's the cast of characters. I didn't mention the guy who didn't show up, the 8th person. He was a Seattleite who left, and he was a freshman at the University of Washington.
So they came to Seattle to organize, to protest. What was their mentality about moving here and their reasons?
The 4 of them had been very active on the Cornell campus, and Cornell had a very active anti-war movement. The organizers, there was a lot of stuff that went on there. There was also a lot of cooperation with the local Black Student Union. If you look up the Cornell Black Student Union, you'll get the stories of the times that the black kids took over one of the big buildings on campus and were posed as if they were Black Panthers. They had guns and stuff, and it was pretty scary all around. And the white guys, the Seattle 7 are all white, were supportive in helping in that process. These guys had a lot of experience, the 4 Cornell people, a lot of experience with organizing and politics, anti-war politics, dissent, and protest. It was actually very convenient for them to get out of town. They had been arrested a number of times at various events, resistance.
In
And-
Ithaca.
In Ithaca, right. In one case, shortly before they moved, their attorney offered the judge a deal, which was, if these guys all leave town, can you just let them go? And they promise they won't be on your docket again ever. And so it was, as I say, they took him up on that. And,
Yes, well,
and
worked for everyone.
They used their bail money that they got back to pay for gas for the trip out. So they picked Seattle, and I interviewed all of these guys, and they all had slightly different reasons for going to Seattle. They sort of converged around one. I'm going to read you what Jeff Dowd told me about why they went to Seattle. None of them had ever been to Seattle. I'm not even sure. Most of them had never even been to the West Coast. They were.
Yeah, could you tell us who Jeff Dowd is again, and
Jeff,
or who he turned out to be?
Who he turned out to be, more likely, right. So Jeff was this kind of creative, crazy guy of the group. Those of you who remember the cult movie, The Big Lebowski, it is essentially modeled after Jeff Dowd. Jeff Dowd was kind of the model for the dude.
It was played by Jeff Bridges in the
correct.
Coen Brothers movie.
Yes,
Yep.
in the Coen Brothers movie. And the reason that Jeff Dowd became known to the Coen Brothers, this was obviously prior to the actual production of The Big Lebowski, Jeff was involved in some theater work in Seattle after the Seattle 7 conspiracy had all sort of died down. This was in the early 80s now. Coen Brothers movie, The Blood Simple, came out, and it did very poorly everywhere in the country except Seattle.
Oh, my.
It did great in Seattle, and the Coen Brothers said, how? And so they called up the theater in Seattle, and they said, well, it's because this guy, Jeff Dowd, has just been going around saying what a great movie it is and doing all kinds of, anyway.
That's hilarious.
So they came up to Seattle, and so they met him and became friends. And Jeff currently been in Los Angeles now for a number of years and does production and other things in the film business. But can I just read a little bit of
Absolutely,
why
yes.
they came to Seattle? Because it is interesting. Okay, he said, we wanted to go to the West Coast for the reasons that many of us are on the West Coast, from decades of people going to the West Coast, right? We went to this rundown farmhouse in upstate New York for a weekend, trying to figure out where we'd go. We wanted to go someplace where we could organize and also live. So we went through a bunch of cities. We didn't consider San Diego very much. On paper, San Jose was very good. Working class, this, that, and the other thing. But we'd heard the Dionne Warwick Backrack song, and we just didn't want to go to San Jose. Portland, we somehow didn't consider. The great place on paper was Honolulu. Working class, military bases, partially third world, etc. But we couldn't picture it, going to Hawaii to organize and sending postcards back saying, okay, we're ready to go. Let us know when the revolution is ready and we'll kick in our shit. We just couldn't justify saying we were organizing in Honolulu. So Seattle on paper looked really, really good. We knew nobody there, though. There was no personal connection. But on paper, of course, you have the whole working class Wobblies background and the Seattle strike, but a small enough town, That's the other thing. Seattle wasn't intimidating like the Bay Area, and Los Angeles was out of the fucking question. We decided to go to Seattle. Knew nobody. Arrived on December 30, 1969, with 10 cents, which we blew on a wrong number. So one of the things about this is that, he mentions we knew about the Wobblies, we knew about the Seattle strike. These guys were educated, and they knew Seattle's labor history. And that's what they were.
That was a factor in their decision.
That was definitely a factor in their decision.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So the Seattle Liberation Front.
Yes.
Is that the correct
Yes.
Acronym translation?
Yeah.
I was interested in the book that there were many different collectives in different neighborhoods, and they had different purposes.
Yeah.
Could you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. When they got to Seattle, primarily when the Ithaca guys got here, the Cornell guys, they immediately set about sort of taking over the anti-war movement as it existed in Seattle, which it did exist. And Michael Lerner had come with the same purpose in mind. He wanted a job, but he also wanted to try some of his democratic Marxist ideas about how to make the student movement and the workers movement, or the middle class regular people movement, realize that they had needs in common and to work together to make the anti-war movement less of a student campus, less of a campus-based organization. So that's what they all wanted. So they got here and almost immediately met, because it was a small community, and formed what was called the Seattle Liberation Front. Now, that's a little dramatic, but in those days, everything was a liberation front because the Vietnamese organization was the Vietnam Liberation Front. So, particularly Chip Marshall he wanted to create an organization that was not super top-down or militant in a very sort of military top-down kind of way. He wanted to allow people who were against the war to just get together and figure out your own little thing that you want to do and go do it. So collectives of college kids and high school kids and community people got together and brainstormed and came up with their own ideas of what they were going to do. And they did all kinds of things. And I'll just give one example. But
Okay.
They supported little strikes that were going on in some industries. There was a strike of photographic workers, which of course doesn't even exist anymore, I'm sure. But one of the things people did was set up a free store for people to pick things up for free. They would work at food banks. They supported the Black Panthers organization in Seattle, which was very much a community support organization and not so much a scary carrying guns around organization. One group went around to dry cleaners all over town and asked, do you have clothes that haven't been picked up for whatever your period of time that they have to be picked up is? And if so, if you have some, would you donate them to us? Because we've got this free store down in Georgetown is where it was. So they would pick up clothes and give them away, as I say, help with food banks, drive people to visit their relatives in prison, help make sandwiches for the school program that the Panthers were running, support a healthcare clinic, lots of stuff like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of philanthropic or almost charitable work, and they were doing those things in different neighborhoods.
And talking about the war at the same time, and talking about racism.
And about racism.
Yeah.
So what happened on February 7th, 1970 that changed everything? I know about half your book is devoted to the day after demonstration and the trial that followed. So what was it the day after, and why was it called the day after demonstration?
Right. This is the other funny connection between the Seattle 7 and the Chicago 7. So the Chicago 7's trial in February of 1970 was winding up, and the jury was out deliberating. And all the anti-war groups around the country completely expected guilty verdicts and everybody off to jail. So they planned that whenever that announcement would be made, whenever the jury came back, there would be demonstrations all over the country in big cities. And there were probably 20 cities that were prepared for this. What happened was the judge in that trial,
Julius Hoffman, he kind of lost it. And he was provoked, obviously, but because that's what Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin did, is they provoked authority. That's right.
But Hoffman really lost it. And he didn't even wait for his jury to come back with their ruling. He called all the defendants, the Chicago 7 and their attorneys, back into court. He just got tired of waiting for the jury, I guess. And he sentenced all of them to jail for contempt of court, which is like, bang, immediately you're in jail.
You're in jail.
Yeah, there's nothing you can do at that point. So that's what the day after demonstration was. It was the day after this high-handed jailing of everybody. And there were demonstrations, indeed, all across the country in different cities.
And how did that play out in Seattle? What happened in Seattle that day?
It was the biggest demonstration probably that had been in Seattle ever, which means several thousand people. So you can see how the city has grown since we've had many, much, much larger demonstrations since then. But a couple thousand people in front of the federal courthouse. It's the old federal courthouse on
downtown.
on 5th between Marion and Spring, right across from the library. Building is still there, but it's not. It isn't the same.
Not a courthouse
It's
anymore.
not a courthouse anymore. But anyway, that's where it was, and they were intending to occupy the courthouse and have like a teach-in around American justice.
Okay.
Pretty unrealistic, as it turned out. The police were very prepared for this demonstration because they were very public about it. You know, they had leaflets going out. I mean, everybody knew it was happening. There ensued a riot with a lot of tear gas is what actually happened. Many people were arrested who were just bystanders. The book has a number of stories of people's arrests. They told me their stories.
Including the Seattle Seven. Were they all arrested or were...
Very good question, because none of them was arrested.
Okay.
Not one. And you would think that if they had been throwing rocks or, beating up cops, they would certainly have been arrested, and they were not. In
so
fact,
they went home that night?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they were the organizers. And
Yes.
so they were very pleased, actually, with the coverage, the publicity, et cetera. And they were so new. This was a very fledgling. This organization was less than a month old.
And they were so young, as you've pointed out.
Right. So not a one was arrested. Two of them weren't even in the state of Washington at the time of the demonstration. But they were singled out, as I was saying, by John Mitchell and J. Edgar Hoover for reasons of their own. And the indictments came down not until April 16th.
So 2 months later.
Yeah, right.
What were the charges?
There were two federal laws that they were charged with. Three, actually, but one was more minor. But the conspiracy law and the anti-riot law. These are both still on the books today. General idea is that it's illegal to intend to riot. And it is illegal to possibly talk to anybody about your intentions. And an intention is like...
Yeah, how do you prove an intention?
Right. It's just a thought,
Yes.
It's just a thought. The other charge had to do with crossing state lines, again, with the intent to conspire. And this was the so-called Rap Brown law that was an attempt to throttle down all the riots in the black ghetto neighborhoods in cities around the country, as if that was a national thing, as if they weren't all cropping up on there because of their own issues. If you cross state lines, it becomes a federal event.
And you had several of these people from New York.
Yes, the New York guys crossed the four. They didn't count Susie and her husband. Her husband actually was not one of the Seattle Seven.
And Michael Lerner was already
and
living
Michael
here.
Lerner was already here, but they got Michael Lerner on the same charge because he had used a telephone to call Jerry Rubin and say, "How's the trial going?"
Oh.
And the telephone at that point was interstate. It was AT&T, right? And it was under the umbrella of the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is interstate. So there we are again.
So those were the charges.
Yeah.
And when did the trial actually begin? And it was moved to Tacoma, is that right? Why did it go to Tacoma?
Yeah, that was probably a mistake on the part of the defendants. They
it was their
they asked that it
choice.
be moved, and it was. The trial didn't start until the Monday of Thanksgiving week, so towards the end of November 1970.
Okay.
So they had a lot of time to organize their defense. Interestingly, the conspiracy charges were a little odd because several of the defendants had never even met each other. They didn't even know each other.
Well, that's a little far-fetched,
Yeah.
isn't it? Do you want to tell us a little bit about the trial and maybe not tell us the outcome, or so that people will have to read the book? Or
The trial was the transcript. It runs a couple thousand pages. I, of course, read it several times.
how long a period did the trial take?
The trial took about 10 days, with another 3 or 4 days to deal with the aftermath. It was a surprise to everybody. I'll say, put it that way.
Okay.
The judge in the case was George Bolt, who was better known, at least in the Pacific Northwest, for his Indian fishing rights judgment, which came a few years later. But he had seen Judge Hoffman in Chicago and knew how he had acted, and he really tried to be better, to not get thrown for a loop by
That's
these
very
guys.
generous.
Yeah, he really did. He wasn't able to hold it all together entirely, but he certainly made an effort. And the guys couldn't decide. The reason the court aspect, I'd say maybe a third of the book is the courtroom.
It's very entertaining
drama.
reading.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. They couldn't decide what their defense approach should be, which is they had two thoughts. One, we're going to get thrown in jail anyway, so let's use the trial as a platform to do what we do best, which is organize against the war. Because we'll get more coverage now because it's a national trial.
Right.
And so let's take advantage of the publicity and just keep hammering away on our points about the illegality of the Vietnam War. So that was one approach. And then the other approach was, and one of their attorneys argued very hard for this approach, who was the only attorney amongst the 3 or 4 attorneys that they had who had a lot of courtroom criminal experience. And this guy, Carl Maxey was his name. He was a Spokane attorney, very interesting guy, wonderful in many, many, many ways. He thought that if they could just clean up their act and show up and keep their mouths shut in trial, he could get him off because it was so obviously ridiculous, the charges.
The charges were.
Especially the guys who weren't even there at the demonstration. So sometimes they thought, okay, we'll do it that way. And then other times they thought, no, we need to make our point about about the war and racism, etc. So they kind of ricocheted back and forth between those two, and that just led to confusion and disaster in the end.
So we won't tell people how it ends, but it was a surprise, as you said.
Yeah.
I note in the epigraph to your book, you quote Senator William Fulbright, who was a Democratic senator. He was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee he was a senator between 1945 and 1974. And he said, in a democracy, dissent is an act of faith. And I wonder if you have any reflections looking back on this now. What is the role of dissent in a democracy? And did the Seattle Seven do anything to promote the role of dissent in democracy? Do you have your thoughts on that? Or
Yeah, the book has sort of 2 levels because my thinking kind of had 2 levels. One was to document and tell the story of these guys.
Because no one had done that
No
before.
one had done it, and it's interesting in a number of ways, both political as well as just entertaining. And I had the good fortune to be able to interview not only all the defendants and their attorneys, but also many policemen and FBI agents and other courtroom personnel. The biggest gap, I guess you could say, is that the primary prosecuting attorney had already died when I started working on the book, which was in the early 2000s. And it was a shame, but he left some paper documentations of his thoughts about the trial, which basically was the government should not have prosecuted this trial, which is interesting. But telling the story is one layer of the book and my thinking. But the other layer is, what about protest? What about dissent? What about activism? What role does that play in a healthy democracy? And the answer is it does. That's my answer anyway. A democracy needs to have a variety of ways for people to voice their opinions and have a role in what a democracy is supposed to mean, which is that it's government by the people, for the people, of the people. And yet we're not talking about mob rule. There's this balance in democracy about protecting minorities. It can't be just majority rule, because then what about the minorities?
Yes.
Religious minorities, racial minorities, whatever. That's not okay. So it's this balance between letting everybody have their say, but in a way that's structured so that the government continues to exist without warfare. We had one civil war. It was terrible. We do not want to have another civil war. But dissent and activism, when played out correctly in a democracy, just make that democracy all that much stronger. And I just thought these guys were a really good example of living that. In the end of the book, I talk about, so where are they now, kind of, and how have they maintained their role as an how many different ways are there of being an activist or being a dissenter, and how have they adapted their adult lives to keeping that in mind as they live.
And what are your conclusions about that?
do.
What are people doing these days? What are these
Yeah.
people that are still with us?
Yeah.
What are they
Yeah.
doing? Are they
They
still promoting social justice?
absolutely, yeah, absolutely, and in quieter ways, of course. They have managed to insert social concerns, things that are bigger than your personal life. I might be very comfortable. I'm white, so that just immediately makes my life easier. And I, was able to go to college. I was educated. I had good jobs, blah, blah, blah. But I haven't, and I say any of these people, haven't forgotten that there is a bigger picture out there. And really, we are only as successful as a community if our whole community is doing well. I mean, we don't want to live in gated communities and, have more police than musicians,
Yeah. where fear is motivating us more
Yeah.
than passion for our neighbor.
Yeah, yeah. And that we need to think of our neighbors as maybe people that are living on the other side of a hill, and they aren't necessarily people we ever will see.
Yes.
But they all together, we create the community that, where we are in Seattle. Seattle is, we live here, and so we want everybody to do well.
Yes.
And people always want that, really, but how many people do anything about it?
Right.
And these guys did.
Is there another excerpt you'd like to read us from the book to kind of wrap up the interview?
I think I would just like to say something about, like we were just talking about, dissent and the role of dissent in our American democracy. This is from the book, towards the end, the epilogue, in fact, I guess.
Okay.
Effective American dissent is a multi-step process of observation, thought, and action. It may not always be a conscious process, but dissenters first recognize a problem, weigh how much they care about it, and consider its significance, both personally and to the wider community. Depending on their conclusions, they might move on to action. Dissent is practiced in many ways. Individual acts of civil disobedience, street marches, protests, demonstrations, boycotts, petitions, street theater, strikes, physical occupations of buildings, civil suits, and electoral activity. Individuals enter and leave the fray as their energy, understanding, resources, and competing commitments wax and wane. Individuals coalesce into groups and organizations, which sometimes collapse under factional infighting, and sometimes they grow into large united fronts. Most dissenters, like the Seattle Seven, are not movie heroes or villains, and they are always a minority of the population. They are individuals with their own energy levels and their own sense of patriotism. Their timing might be ill-advised. They may misjudge the strength and the rootedness of the problem they wish to fix. Stop reading here for a second and say that was, to me, the biggest problem with the anti-war movement. I was very active in the anti-war movement, not in Seattle here, but we just didn't realize how flexible and yet inflexible the government was. We didn't understand, and I think today we have this problem with racism. We do not understand how rooted racism is, and we think we keep thinking we've gotten rid of it. I mean, after the Civil War, we thought, okay, good, now no more, and then again and again and again, we keep thinking we've dealt with it, and it's very, very rooted.
It seems like each new generation has to kind of rethink it and restate it and refight it sometimes.
Because we older people haven't fixed it.
No, we haven't.
So we don't understand the rootedness, and we may have only a partial grasp on the consequences of our actions. Still, they, the Seattle Seven, choose to step beyond a life of family, home, and career in order to engage with others in some of our world's greatest challenges. Protest is risky because, as one activist put it, when you expose a problem, you pose a problem. I was thinking about that actually just the other day, and I thought about the environmental movement. That girl.
Greta Thunberg.
Greta, right. Greta.
Yes, and a lot of young activists like her.
Yeah.
The children in Parkland.
Yes, the anti-gun people, kids.
Yes, gives us hope.
Oh, it so much does. I so agree.
It's wonderful. I mean, it's sad to see that they have to fight the same battles, but it seems to be inevitable. Democracy is a work in progress.
Yes.
And we all have to keep working at it. And, but that's a beautiful statement that you just read about that. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about maybe a future writing project that you've got going, or?
Oh, well, thank you.
Will you have another book coming out?
This is my third book, and all three of them are very different. I don't really like doing the same thing twice.
It doesn't seem like it since you just wrote a young adult novel.
Yeah, right. Very, very different stuff. So I'm now thinking about, and I'm just at the thinking and sort of researching, reading phase. I'd like to treat in some way, I don't know how yet at all, something about traveling, something about human beings in motion. And there's voluntary travel, where you pick where you're going to go on vacation. I mean, something as simple as that. And there's involuntary travel, refugees, immigrants, things like that. And human beings have always been on the move. I mean, if you think we all came out of the Great Rift Valley in Africa, right? Slowly, I mean, we've
all migrated.
Yeah, we're all migrants in so many ways. I'm not thinking about it as a travel book or as about where you go. It's the getting there part. The travel can be slow, it can be fast, can be jet planes, it can be walking, it can be with other people, it can be solo, and it has different meanings kind of from the people who do it. So anyway, I'm
it
totally
sounds fascinating.
Yeah, I'm totally playing with the idea.
So you're concentrating on the journey, not the destination.
Correct.
Which is sort of how protest on trial works too. It's the journey, not the outcome, which the listeners will have to read the book to find out how the trial ended up. So, well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Kit. And I want to tell your listeners that they can find out more about you and your work at your website, which is www.kitbakke, which is KITBAKKE.com. And thank you for listening to this episode of Literary News. I'm Florence Minot.